Well, welcome back to Just Liberty, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, here with my co host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. And together we're trying to take back liberty from the political extremes. And today's show is no exception. Our topic today is free speech. And free speech is very closely related to religious freedom. After all, think about what you do in practicing your religion. Awful lot of it is speech, isn't it? Preaching, sermons, singing, uh, reading scriptures. So much has to do with speech, evangelizing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So the question of the hour is every administration, in some ways, tries to restrict speech and violate free speech. So, how do we assess what is happening today with the current administration? Is it any different or any worse than any previous administration, Republican or Democrat? Because after all, free speech is for all of us, regardless of our politics, right? It is for conservatives and liberals alike. So, Bettina, we have a great interview that you did. Unfortunately, I wasn't part of it, but I've listened to it, and I'm really grateful that we're going to broadcast this. So, why don't you introduce our guest?
Thanks, Alan. Yes, it was a fascinating interview, and I was sorry that you couldn't join us because I know that free speech is dear and near to your heart. But we decided that we needed to talk to someone about this issue since so many issues of free speech were emerging in the news that's coming out of the current administration, and many of the court cases that have been precipitated by the actions of this administration. So we decided to go to the experts. We decided to reach out to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And that's an organization that's really dedicated to defending First Amendment free speech rights. And we spoke to Aaron Terr, who is an attorney, and he's also their director of public advocacy. And it was a great conversation. Let's roll it. Well, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today and to shed some light on what is a really confusing time for most Americans, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is. There's certainly a lot going on, and it's honestly it's even hard for me to keep up with, and I do this for a living. So I can definitely understand the average American who's not a lawyer, who doesn't devote their life to free speech and First Amendment advocacy, can have a tough time to keep up with everything that's happening, and that has happened during the first 100 days of this administration. But thank you for having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I'm glad we're tackling this topic because, as you say, there's a lot of confusion out there. And the headlines are coming so quickly, it's very hard to process them. But I want to start by building sort of a base of principle or a sort of a foundation for what we're going to talk about. And I want to start with a question that I think confuses many people, which is, an organization such as yours, for instance, in the past, it would have been pretty easily pigeonholed as a liberal advocacy organization because it deals with free speech. But the issue of free speech these days has kind of become muddied. So who owns free speech as an issue? Is it a liberal value or is it a conservative value?
Yeah, I don't think it's a conservative or liberal value. I think it's a constitutional value. It's free speech is fundamentally a check on power, on government power. We need the First Amendment because power brings with it the temptation to silence dissent. That's human nature. And the First Amendment ensures that no single person or administration can declare by fiat what's true and false, what's right and wrong, and make it illegal to disagree. So I think wherever you fall politically, you have a strong interest, you have a stake in being free from that kind of authoritarian nightmare where the government just has complete control over what we can say and think. But I do free speech hypocrisy, and or free speech opportunism, or however you want to describe it, is unfortunately common.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Yeah. Both liberals and conservatives are guilty of exploiting free speech when it's politically convenient and abandoning it when it's not. Right? When they're out of power, their only weapon is their voice, and they will rediscover the virtues of free speech. Right? But then once they're back in power, um, and they realize, oh, well, now I can pull the levers of government to silence my political opponents, censorship starts to look appealing again. And free speech starts to look like a little bit of a nuisance. So that's kind of the dynamic that unfortunately has played out. I think when you look through American history, right, there are periods where and contexts in which free speech was more kind of coded left or right.
Yeah.
And it's always dependent on who was kind of the dominant ideology, the dominant power at the time, right? You had the free speech movement at Berkeley in the 1960s when left-wing views and students were the ones who were clamoring for more power. But then over the last couple decades, and this is why, like you were mentioning, how fire's reputation and how we're perceived, and yeah, we've long gotten criticisms of being a right-leaning organization, even though we are nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because for our first 20 years, we exclusively defended free speech and academic freedom on campus. And it just so happens that many campuses, progressive or left-wing viewpoints are dominant. So that means that if you don't hold those views, you're the one who's more, if you're a conservative, a centrist, or even someone on the left who bucks the orthodoxy a bit, you're the one who's likely to face censorship. So the majority of our cases, I think, over that time were defending censorship coming from the left. But again, that was just a function of who the dominant faction is on campus, right? And by the way, we also had tons of cases going the other way. It wasn't exclusively coming from the left. Um, but it's funny, like now that the Trump administration is in its second term and is threatening free speech in so many different ways, and that's been monopolizing most of our work and attention. Now we're getting the opposite criticism. Now people are saying that we're a left wing hacks or whatever, or we're just kind of like reflexively anti-Trump, which is ridiculous if you look at our record. But yeah, sorry, that's a very
No,
long-winded answer. But
it goes back to your first point, which is that that free speech looks really attractive when you're in the minority and less attractive when you're in the majority. And so that reflects throughout American history. Um, I want to also ask about how free speech is perceived in relation to other civil liberties, because I know the magazine I edit, Liberty Magazine, I guess sometimes we could be accused of fixating too closely on the religion clauses of the First Amendment and not really thinking about the free speech bit of the First Amendment. But how far do people tend to forget, I guess, how closely intertwined civil liberties really are?
yeah, absolutely. Free speech and religious liberty, I think, are clustered in the same constitutional amendment for a reason. Um, well, free speech, and the reason I have dedicated my career to defending free speech is I think it's arguably the most important right that we have, in that I view it as the precondition for all other rights. Because without free speech, you can't even argue in defense of other rights or oppose their infringement. Um, so they're closely intertwined, and they're also intertwined with rights like the right to due process of law. Rights because that means that the government can't arbitrarily deprive you of rights like free speech without going through a fair legal process. So yeah, they're interrelated, and I think free speech and religious freedom in particular are closely intertwined. Um, Fire has had cases that implicate both freedoms. for example, a college denying a Christian student group official recognition or funding or equal access to resources just because of their religious views.
Yeah.
That's a violation both of their right to free speech and their right to exercise their religion. Um, and religious liberty, of course, often involves speech and expressive acts. When a Catholic priest or a rabbi is delivering a sermon, or a Muslim is kneeling down on a prayer rug, in silent prayer. Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door to evangelize, right? These are all protected acts of free speech and religious freedom. Uh, and the First Amendment also, of course, protects the right to express opinions on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage that might be informed by a person's religious beliefs. So, yeah, and the other thing I would say is that both of these rights are most important for people who have minority views or beliefs. Again, going back to that theme of, right, when you're a vulnerable minority, right, that's when you you most need these rights to protect you, because you're the one most likely to face censorship by hostile governments or disapproving majorities.
So, it's interesting to me that, when we're talking about what's happening now with the Trump administration, we're seeing this problem emerge in a very real way. I mean, the rubber is hitting the road. We can all agree in abstract that free speech is a fantastic idea. But then when we start seeing how government policy and how, politics starts interfacing with that right of free speech, we start getting these really polarized disagreements. So, maybe let's start talking about some of those issues that have really thrown the issue of free speech into relief recently. From your perspective as someone who works in this field all the time, what are the key actions of this administration which raise free speech concerns for you?
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
You've got attempts to deport foreign students and green card holders because of their anti-Israel advocacy. You've got the administration trying to cripple law firms for opposing him in court or representing clients or causes he dislikes, revoking their access to federal buildings, pressuring federal contractors who do business with them to cut ties. The administration is stripping universities of federal funding for refusing to accept the administration's demands that they impose speech codes, that they adopt ideological litmus tests, and generally relinquish academic freedom. You've got federal prosecutors threatening criminal investigations over speech that is critical of the administration or its allies. You've got the White House cutting off press access to outlets based on their views and editorial choices. The FCC launching baseless investigations into news networks whose coverage displeases the president. And that's not even an exhaustive list. And none of this is subtle. It's a pattern. It's the federal government using its full weight to pressure, intimidate, and punish dissent and people or speakers whose speech the administration finds politically inconvenient. And I think it's notable how open the administration has been about it. It doesn't hide the fact that it's targeting speakers based on their viewpoints, even though that is the cardinal sin of First Amendment law. It's the government trying to rig political debate in its favor by shutting down one side of it. But I think that boldness and openness is intentional because the goal isn't just to punish individual speakers, it's to send a message. It's to make others think twice before they speak up, before they represent the quote unquote wrong client, or before they protest a government policy. And when that kind of intimidation comes from the highest levels of government, it's easy to see how it can freeze people into silence.
So, okay, so let's help people understand how an infringement in one area can sort of filter down and start endangering the whole constitutional regime of free speech in ways that could affect us as individuals ultimately. So the issue of law firms.
Mhm.
So for many people looking at wealthy, elite law firms, this is not a sympathetic scenario here. And I guess maybe that's part of the rationale for targeting this group so directly, because there's not going to be a lot of pushback from the American public generally, right? Because this is an unpopular group. So how, this chilling effect, this viewpoint chilling effect that you're describing in law firms, how can that have sort of a knock-on effect down the road and ultimately harm, regular Americans?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that I think part of the strategy is to go after targets that might be unsympathetic to broad swaths of the American public. Law firms is one, the elite universities like Harvard and Columbia are another. But to take the example of law firms, so so Trump is targeting these major law firms because of who they represented, what type of cases they've taken on. So, for example, one firm was targeted because it represented Dominion voting systems, which in its a successful defamation lawsuit against Fox News over claims about rigged voting machines, right? Another was targeted because of the pro bono work it did, including challenging Trump's policies on immigration. And the effect of these orders is to deny access to federal buildings, revoke security clearances, and basically cripple their ability to represent parties in disputes with the federal government. And it's also, the administration is also using these threats to pressure firms into agreeing to deals to do millions of dollars of free pro bono work on initiatives that the administration supports. So there's punishment, and there's also this kind of almost extortion, really, where Trump recently boasted that he's building a network of lawyers that will be loyal, and that's, I think, so to break this down into why like ordinary people should care about it. I think it's a serious threat, broadly speaking, to the independence of our legal system, to the rule of law, and I get that lawyers aren't always the most sympathetic figures. Everyone knows a good lawyer joke, and I say that as a lawyer. But at the end of the day, our society depends on the rule of law. It depends on there being lawyers willing to represent unpopular clients who may be just ordinary Americans who are in the government's crosshairs. There need to be lawyers willing to challenge the legality of government actions and policies, to prevent us from sliding into an authoritarian society where there is no rule of law. And if you're someone who's being prosecuted by the government, who's challenging a law's constitutionality, or your rights are otherwise under threat, you probably need a lawyer. But the danger of the administration's actions is that it's making it so that lawyers may be scared to represent you in your case. They're scared to take on any case where they think that they might face retaliation from the government. And another thing always to keep in mind when you're talking about censorship and intimidation of people based on their free speech or their advocacy, is that even if you kind of support the people who the policy outcomes for the current administration, and you don't like who's being targeted, it's laying the groundwork for future administrations to wield that same power against people and organizations who you do agree with, who you do support, right? So right now, today it's Harvard and Columbia University and elite left-leaning law firms or mainstream media outlets like CBS and NBC, right? But tomorrow it could be religious universities. It could be Fox and other conservative media, right? It could be there are also law firms that kind of have a focus of representing conservative clients and viewpoints. So they could be targeted by a future administration and have their access to federal buildings cut off if we leave these attacks unchecked.
So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, basically.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so let me let me then play devil's advocate just a little. There may be some listening who say, yeah, it doesn't sound real good what the Trump administration is doing, but it's not unprecedented. And we saw in the Obama administration, for instance, especially with regard to like Title IX, interpretation of Title IX requirements, sex discrimination on campuses, and so on. We saw attempts to coerce speech. How would you respond to something like that?
Yeah. Past administrations absolutely engaged in censorship, to be clear.
Okay.
I think all presidential administrations push boundaries to some extent. But what sets Trump's current term apart is the scope and scale and bold use of state power to retaliate against his opponents and silence dissent. It's a systematic and coordinated attack on, or it's a systematic and coordinated crackdown, I should say, on dissent, and retaliation against those who the president perceives to stand in the way of his political agenda. Fire has criticized the Obama and Biden administrations for threatening free speech. You mentioned Title IX. That's an issue that we've long been involved in and advocating for the regulations that Trump, to his credit, during his first term, repealed those previous Obama era Title IX rules, and we applauded that. We advocated for that, and it strengthened due process and free speech protections for all college students. So that was critically important. The Biden administration, we heavily criticized for leaning on social media platforms to police so-called misinformation. But what we're seeing under President Trump in his second term, which I think is different even from his first term, is massive in scale and scope and how openly it's being done. And some of it, like the executive orders targeting law firms, or stripping colleges of federal funding without going through any of the established legal processes. Some of that appears to be unprecedented. So yeah, there's a pattern of both parties pushing the limits of government power in ways that violate or chill free speech. But I think the way the current administration is blowing past those limits is noteworthy. And if we don't acknowledge that, we risk normalizing a level of retaliation and control that no administration, left or right, should be allowed to exercise. Yeah. So, but I understand. I get it. Like it's not like the government engaging in censorship is something completely new.
Right. But you're talking about this deluge of attempts to silence dissent in different ways, which leads to my next question of, are our courts equipped to deal with this? And, is this the only way that these attempts will be effectively checked? Are there other ways that citizens can push back against encroachments on free speech? I mean, what do you foresee? Look into your crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen over the next few months and years.
My crystal ball is always a little bit blurry, but I'll try. Courts are critical. They're also can be slow, but they play a very important role right now. And there have been some encouraging early rulings already. In the Associated Press case, for example, this is where President Trump revoked the Associated Press's access to certain press events in the White House because it refuses to use the term Gulf of America instead of the traditional term for that body of water, Gulf of Mexico. And a federal judge blocked the White House from excluding AP journalists just because they're not accepting the administration's preferred terminology. It's a constitutionally protected editorial choice that they're making. So that's a clear win for press freedom. And the law firms challenging Trump's executive orders, some are standing up to the administration, have already secured temporary restraining orders, blocking their enforcement. And so that's a strong signal from the courts that that kind of retaliation does not pass constitutional muster. So the courts, yeah, they're a critically important check. But yeah, like I said, they can be slow, and a lot of harm can happen to free speech rights before a judge can even weigh in. And I think that is where public pressure matters too. Um, when universities or law firms or journalists or advocacy groups speak out when they refuse to cave to the government pressure, that helps reinforce the legal boundaries. And just the more people that speak up, it just sends the message that we're not going to allow this type of infringement on Americans' rights to be normalized or tolerated. Um, and there have been some encouraging signs of resistance from institutions like Harvard, which, regardless of what you feel, again, about Harvard, and again, FIRE has been very critical of Harvard's record on free speech.
I know. I mean, I've seen your, you've done your, is it an annual survey or a list of your?
Yeah, free speech rank, our college free speech rank.
Yes, which is, and Harvard doesn't do well on those, right?
Not only do they not do well, they finished dead last for the last 2 years consecutively.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they're not beyond reproach, but the solution isn't to substitute Harvard's own infringement on student and faculty free speech with a government version of it, right? And because the government is making demands of Harvard that would essentially make it the provost of the university, and that would give it extensive control over the academic mission, and that would require new speech codes and different sorts of ideological litmus tests, and would basically we wouldn't have free speech and academic freedom anymore, because the whole idea of academic freedom is that you have universities that are free to study, to evaluate new ideas, to follow the evidence where it goes without political interference. When the government gets involved, it's not going to lead anywhere good, and it's going to kind of defeat the whole purpose of why universities exist in the first place. But what I was going to say is that Harvard, at least, is one of the institutions that's standing up, refusing to cave to the administration's demands. And we've also now seen public commentators from across the political spectrum, including conservatives, who still believe strongly in constitutional principles and the rule of law, calling out the administration for its lawless actions. So there have been some encouraging signs, and I think that things like that show that this isn't just a partisan issue, right? When you see even people on the right who are kind of expressing alarm at what's happening, this isn't just partisan bickering. It's genuine and well-founded concern about the administration's encroachment on constitutional limits on its power.
You mentioned Harvard pushing back, and there's been rumblings about the IRS, taking action on Harvard's tax-exempt status and whatnot. There's also been commentary that I've seen that, well, this is not unprecedented, because you learn Bob Jones University in the 1970s, the government more or less enforced its viewpoint on private college via the tax code. Can you unpack that aspect a little? And also, what are the potential dangers down the track? Because there's a whole heap of nonprofit organizations out there, many of them religious as well, who, would have reason to not want the government to weigh in on their particular viewpoints.
Yeah, so first, I think it's important to establish a constitutional principle here, which is that, and this also applies to the defunding of universities, in addition to possibility of revoking tax-exempt status. No one's arguing, certainly FIRE's not arguing, that universities or any institution has an automatic right to federal funds or to a tax exemption, or that those funds or benefits can't come with certain strings attached. But the nature of those strings matters. So the government can't leverage funding, whether it's a grant, a contract, or a tax exemption, to strong arm private institutions or individuals into giving up their constitutional rights. These benefits can't be used as a tool to enforce ideological conformity. And so that's what Trump has signaled, though, that he is doing in terms of both defunding universities, and potentially revoking their tax exempt status. I think he said um, that he suggested stripping Harvard's tax exempt status because he doesn't like the views being expressed on campus. What he called what was it political, ideological, and terrorist inspired speech. Uh, um, and yeah, there are rumors of the administration targeting other nonprofits today. Although right before our conversation, I saw a headline that the administration said it's not going to be going after environmental advocacy groups as had been suspected. So that may be a good sign if that's true. Um, but yeah, but so no one's automatically entitled to a government benefit, but the government can't weaponize them to suppress disfavored speech. A 501c3 status tax exemption is a benefit for institutions that have an educational, religious, or charitable purpose. And yeah, we have been here before with President Nixon trying to audit his enemies. The Obama administration was criticized for targeting conservative nonprofits, the IRS under Obama targeting conservative nonprofits, and those actions were rightly condemned. And I think this is no different. If we we start using the tax code to punish dissent, no group is safe. Whether it's Harvard, the Heritage Foundation, the ACLU, a church, a climate group, whoever. And just to address the Bob Jones rebuttal, it's true that the court upheld revoking Bob Jones University tax exempt status due to their policy of racial discrimination. I think it was, for example, not allowing like race mixing on campus and maybe a couple other things. But that case it went through these procedures. It took years, spanned multiple administrations, and was based on this unambiguous and longstanding federal policy of non-discrimination. So yeah, you can argue that it was about like ideological misalignment, but it also wasn't just purely about punishing speech, or like an ideological position on an issue, but rather the discriminatory conduct. So I think that that's very different from what the administration is proposing now, which is to go after First Amendment protected speech and advocacy, and to do it in a way that doesn't abide by any of the established legal processes
Right.
for revoking these government benefits.
Right. And, there's a whole heap of due process rights attached to, or due
Mhm.
process, that has to play out in a multi-year legal case, as opposed to an EO that shot out of the White House office, right?
Right, exactly. And one of the other objections I've seen is well, the Trump administration has every right to revoke federal funding from universities that they argue, like Bob Jones, have engaged in racial discrimination through their DEI policies or their admission in policies, or through allowing anti-Semitic harassment on campus post October 7th. But again, what this argument ignores is two things. First of all, the government is also explicitly targeting these universities based on speech, on faculty speech, on the nature of academic programs, on the views that students are expressing at these protests. And secondly, if you are going to go after the universities for violating anti-discrimination law, you have to go through a process. The government can go to court and make that argument, or it can follow a process where it first has to notify the institution of the alleged violation. This is all laid out in federal law, and strive to achieve compliance by voluntary means. And the Department of Education has done that in the past under previous administrations, where it reached resolution agreements. Now, if that's not possible, then the government has to put its findings on the record, has to hold a hearing, allow the university to defend itself, and then submit a written report to Congress. And then the funding cut also has to be limited to the program or part of the university found to be non-compliant. So that means you can't cut funding for cancer research, as the administration has just done at Harvard, because, for example, there was a civil rights violation in the humanities department. right? And I just want to emphasize that these procedures exist for a reason. They're intended to ensure fairness, reduce error, and prevent political abuse. And so that the government can't just arbitrarily revoke your funding or tax exemption or benefits because up and decides one day it doesn't like something you said.
Right.
And the administration is bypassing all those procedures and basically issuing a sentence before there's been a verdict or even a proper investigation.
Okay, so let's wrap up by going back to where we started, which is how are we mere mortals meant to be sorting through the headlines that we're getting? Because, you get these opposing views expressed by talking heads on conservative networks and, more liberal networks, and you're getting different perspectives and different and you get lost in the forest. You can't see the whole forest because you're just looking at the individual trees. How, as someone who works in this space, how would you advise us to sort through this in our own minds? How do we read headlines in a way that is constructive rather than just overwhelming?
Yeah, no, I get that there's a lot going on and this stuff can be hard to parse. There's a lot of noise. It can be uh, hard to separate legitimate concerns from the partisan narratives that get wrapped around them. Excuse me. Um, but I'm obviously biased, but I'd encourage people to follow Fire's commentary on free speech issues. I think our track record speaks for itself. We're nonpartisan. We've opposed censorship from the left and the right over our 25 years. We don't pull punches. We don't pick sides. We're trying to call balls and strikes on the First Amendment and free speech principles as our only guide. And so I think we can be a useful resource for people who want clarity. Um, and healthy skepticism is always a good thing. Don't take everything you see at face value, whether it's from the administration's defenders or its critics. Um, I just gave the example when it comes to the efforts to strip funding from universities, where many defenders will say it's about enforcing civil rights laws. Don't just automatically accept that explanation because, as I just explained, it's really going far beyond that. Um, so, but in the months ahead, I would encourage people to watch for how the legal and cultural pushback builds. As I mentioned, we're already seeing pushback from across the ideological spectrum. People who don't agree on much, but do agree that government retaliation against speech crosses a red line. Um, and 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 again, there have already been some preliminary court victories, and we'll see more court challenges, and hopefully more courts reining in the administration when it violates the Constitution. And again, and look at like what conservative judges are ruling. There was uh, a 7-2 Supreme Court decision on that immigration issue involving the person who was wrongfully deported despite an order that uh, withholding his removal to El Salvador, right? So um, that right, that should signal that it's not a partisan issue if you have a 7-2 Supreme Court decision, including most of the conservative leaning justices, or Judge Harvey Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit, who recently issued um, an opinion that really frankly raised concerns about how the administration is flirting with undermining the rule of law, right? And for a conservative judge like Judge Wilkinson, who's been on the bench for many years, to say something like that should raise anyone's antenna. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's always a good sign when you see liberals and conservatives singing off the same hymn sheet. That's a reason to take notice right there. And, I really appreciate you taking the time to help us understand that, free speech, it's not a liberal or conservative value. As you said, it's a constitutional value. So thank you very, very much. And, we really do wish you all the best with your continued efforts.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on to talk about these really important issues.
As everybody knows by now, having watched the interview, I wasn't there for the interview, but I just listened to it, and it is fresh in mind. And oh, so many things my head is spinning, Bettina. Uh, my first observation, though, is his point about free speech being so fundamental to all of our rights. And
Yeah.
traditionally, it has enjoyed what we call strict scrutiny, very high legal protection as a fundamental right. And yet he pointed out that free speech and free are so closely intertwined, and yet the Supreme Court years ago backed away from protecting religious freedom with the same level of respect. And that makes no sense. Now that's not something that he pointed out, but I think, his main point and the main value of this interview is to give us perspective, right? As I started to say in the opening, every administration, targets free speech in some way, right? So from the left, we see targets against certain, right wing or conservative values, promotion, say, of DEI, LGBT types of interests, and so in this administration, we see the opposite pushback against that, So the question is this any different, worse? And how do we assess? And
Yes.
I think his answer is it's different and it's unprecedented because it's not just targeting a particular issue. It is trying to intimidate any kind of dissent very, very broadly. And I don't know that he made this point, but by attacking the major institutions, the press,
Yes.
our universities, and our major law firms. So it's a very broad-based, intentional attempt to suppress all forms of dissent.
And what struck me too is that even if eventually the courts weigh in and they say that his actions have been unconstitutional, the chilling effect has already occurred.
Correct.
And that, when you put that in context of the magnitude, the sheer number of actions the administration has taken to chill speech in the first 100 days of its administration, I mean,
Right.
what we are seeing is not normal. And, we talk a lot on this program, on this podcast, Alan, about canary in the coal mine moments. And I think this is one.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can afford not to take it seriously.
No, we can't. Um, and, the image that comes to my mind when you talk about the chilling effect is whack-a-mole. Because you can file a lawsuit and you can whack down one violation, another one pops up over here, and you know the fact is nobody wants to be in court trying to defend their rights.
No.
No institution, no individual. I represent people whose rights are violated. Did they wake up in the morning one day and say, I would love to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit? I'd love to challenge somebody for violating my rights. No, nobody wants that, but
It's
and there's
expensive. It
just
takes
so
over your
many
life.
of them. Well, it's more than money. It's just
Right.
the emotional cost and
Yeah.
no, it's out of control. But I don't know if our listeners really understand what we mean by chilling effect. You know, if
Interesting.
So I think that bears just a moment to say, look, if you know that if you exercise your rights, if you dissent, if you stick your head up, you're going to get it chopped off. You're going to think twice about, you're going to just keep your head down and play it safe and not speak your mind. You're going to wonder, should I be speaking out on social media? You know, um, Whatever it is that you do. And that's what's meant by a chilling effect. You're not going to exercise your rights in the first place because you're afraid of getting punished for it.
Well, Alan, I think this has been an important discussion, and I think it's one that we should probably revisit in the very near future. And I think we're going to be offered many opportunities to engage with this topic by this administration. But thanks for joining us, listeners. and we hope you'll stay engaged and that you'll join us next time for our conversation on just liberty. Remember, until next time, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.